The city was bustling, a cacophony of car horns, hurried footsteps, and faint echoes of street performers playing for loose change. The winter wind bit hard, weaving through the towering skyscrapers and nipping at those who dared linger too long in its path. Among the crowds, a man shuffled down the sidewalk, his thin jacket doing little to protect him from the chill. His face was lined with hardship, his eyes searching for kindness in a city that often forgot him. The man's name was Jack, a former teacher who had fallen on hard times, his life unraveling after a series of unfortunate events. Yet, despite his circumstances, there was a glimmer of hope in his gaze, a belief that people, deep down, were good. On the other side of the city, in the heart of Manhattan, Barron Trump stepped out of a sleek black SUV. At 17, he was tall and composed, with an air of quiet confidence that belied his youth. He had inherited his parents' poise, but carried himself with a calm demeanor that set him apart. The city was no stranger to him. He had grown up amidst its grandeur, its chaos, and its sharp contrasts. Today, he was headed to a charity event, a cause close to his heart. Despite the privilege he was born into, Barron had always felt a pull toward helping those less fortunate, a trait nurtured by his mother, Melania, who often reminded him of the importance of compassion. As the SUV drove away, Barron adjusted his scarf and glanced around. The streets were alive with activity, a blend of luxury and struggle. He noticed a street musician playing a soulful tune on his saxophone, a couple laughing as they walked hand in hand, and a small child tugging at his mother's coat to point at the glittering window displays. He also noticed Jack, standing a few feet away near a coffee cart, his hands trembling as he held a small cardboard sign that read, "Just $1 can help." Barron's brow furrowed. He had seen people like Jack before, but something about the man's posture, his quiet dignity despite his obvious struggle, struck a chord. He paused, unsure of what to do. He wasn't the type to brush off situations like this, nor was he one to make impulsive decisions. Instead, he observed, taking in the details, the way Jack's shoes were worn to the soles, the careful way he avoided meeting anyone's eyes, and the faint but genuine smile he gave to those who walked past without sparing him a glance. Jack noticed Barron too. He didn't recognize him as the son of a former president, nor did he see the tailored coat or expensive scarf. What caught his attention was the way the young man seemed to truly look at him, not through him, as so many others did. Their eyes met briefly, and Jack offered the same faint smile, a reflexive gesture born more out of habit than expectation. Barron hesitated, torn between continuing on his way and doing something more. The voice of his mother echoed in his mind. "It's not about what you give, Barron, but the heart with which you give it." He decided to act, stepping toward the coffee cart where Jack stood. "Hi," Barron said, his voice calm and even. Jack looked up, surprised by the approach. Most people avoided him or pretended not to see him. "Hello," Jack replied, his voice raspy but kind. "Would you like a coffee?" Barron asked, nodding toward the cart. "It's freezing out here." Jack blinked, caught off guard by the offer. That would be nice. "Thank you." Barron ordered 2 coffees, handing one to Jack before taking a sip from his own. For a moment, they stood in silence, the crowd flowing around them like water around rocks. Finally, Jack spoke. "I don't mean to bother anyone," he said, gesturing to his sign. It's been a tough year." Barron nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Everyone has a story," he said. "What's yours?" Jack hesitated, then began to speak, sharing fragments of his life. A teaching career he had loved, a family he had lost touch with, and the series of events that had led him here. Barron listened intently, his gaze never wavering. When Jack finished, there was a long pause. "You're stronger than you think," Barron said finally, "and you deserve more than this." Jack chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I'm not sure about that, but thank you." Barron reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. He didn't just hand over $1 or a bill. Instead, he paused, thinking. "You don't just need help for today," he said, more to himself than to Jack. "You need a chance." Jack frowned, unsure of what Barron meant, but before he could ask, the young man extended his hand. "Come with me," Barron said. "Let's figure something out." Jack stared at him, stunned. "Why would you do that?" "Because I can," Barron replied simply. And because I think you'd do the same if the roles were reversed. Reluctantly, Jack took his hand, and together they stepped into the flow of the city, their unlikely encounter setting the stage for a journey neither of them could have anticipated. As Barron and Jack made their way through the city, the tension between their vastly different worlds became palpable. Jack, unaccustomed to the luxury surrounding Barron, felt out of place but also curious. He kept his questions to himself, too wary of breaking the fragile thread of trust that had unexpectedly formed between them. Barron, on the other hand, was focused. He had a plan forming in his mind, one that he hoped could help Jack beyond a single gesture of kindness. Their first stop was a small diner tucked into a quiet corner of the city, far from the glitz and noise. Barron had chosen it deliberately, knowing it offered warmth and privacy. As they sat down, the waitress, a middle-aged woman with a kind smile, handed them menus. Jack hesitated, unsure if he should order. Sensing his discomfort, Barron spoke up. "Get whatever you want," he said, his tone reassuring. "You need a good meal." Jack nodded slowly and chose a modest dish, still uneasy about accepting too much. When the food arrived, he ate carefully, savoring every bite as if it might be his last. Barron watched him, a mixture of empathy and determination in his expression. "So," Barron began after a while, "what's the first thing you'd do if things were different? If you didn't have to worry about where you'd sleep or eat tomorrow?" Jack paused, caught off guard by the question. He set his fork down and leaned back, thinking. "I'd go back to teaching," he said finally. "I miss it. Helping kids, watching them learn. It gave me purpose." Barron nodded, storing the information. "And what's stopping you?" Jack chuckled, a bitter edge to his voice. "Everything. No home, no clean clothes, no money. Who's going to hire a guy like me?" Barron didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "What if I told you that we could change that? That you could have a second chance?" Jack raised an eyebrow, skepticism written all over his face. "I'd say you're an optimist, but I've learned not to expect much." "Well," Barron said, "maybe it's time to expect more." But as the days unfolded, Barron realized helping Jack wouldn't be as simple as he'd thought. His plan was to connect Jack with resources, a temporary shelter, clean clothes, and a meeting with a non-profit organization Barron had worked with before. Yet, even with these steps in place, the world around them wasn't so accommodating. The first sign of trouble came when Barron's identity was recognized. At the non-profit office, where he had brought Jack to meet a caseworker, whispers began to circulate. Within minutes, the staff and visitors were buzzing, their eyes darting between Barron and Jack. Some were curious, others resentful. A young woman sitting in the waiting area muttered to her friend, "What's he doing here? Playing savior for the cameras?" Barron overheard the comment but ignored it. Jack, however, couldn't. He shifted uncomfortably, his shoulders hunching as though he were trying to disappear. After their meeting, he turned to Barron outside the building. "Why are you doing this, really?" Jack asked, his voice low but laced with frustration. "Is this about helping me, or is it about proving something to the world?" Barron froze, taken aback. "What? No, this isn't about anyone else. It's about you." Jack sighed, rubbing his face. "It's hard to believe that, Barron. People like me, we're not charity projects. We're people." Barron's jaw tightened, hurt flashing in his eyes. "I know that. I'm not trying to fix everything in one day. I want to help. But if you don't want me to, I'll stop." Jack stared at him, caught in a battle between pride and gratitude. Finally, he shook his head. "I'm sorry. It's not you. It's just, this isn't easy for me." Their conversation lingered in Barron's mind, and as the days went on, the challenges only grew. Jack's progress was slow, hindered by both external obstacles and his own insecurities. When Barron helped him secure a temporary job at a local bookstore, Jack nearly quit on his first day, overwhelmed by the stares and whispers from coworkers who clearly judged him for his disheveled appearance. "It's like I have a sign on my back that says failure," Jack said bitterly that evening. They were sitting on a park bench, the city lights twinkling around them. "How am I supposed to move forward when everyone keeps looking at me like I'm stuck?" Barron didn't have an immediate answer. He could see Jack struggle, and he felt the weight of it too. But there was also something else. external pressures that were beginning to creep into Barron's life. News of his involvement with Jack had reached the media, and headlines ranged from admiration to cynicism. Barron Trump's unlikely friendship, genuine kindness, or a PR stunt? One article read. Barron's family had noticed too. While Melania was supportive, cautioning him to stay true to his intentions, others were more skeptical. Friends from his social circle questioned his choices, some even mocking him for wasting time on someone they deemed beyond help. "You don't owe this guy anything," one friend had said during a lunch. "Why risk your reputation for someone who might not even want your help?" But Barron couldn't let it go. He saw in Jack a reflection of something deeper, a vulnerability and resilience that reminded him of the human side of life he sometimes felt detached from in his privileged world. Still, the pressure weighed on him. Every step forward seemed to come with a new challenge, a new reason to question whether his efforts were making a difference. And while Barron wrestled with these doubts, Jack faced his own inner battle. His pride and fear of failure often clashed with his growing hope, creating a tension that neither of them could escape. As the days passed, their bond grew stronger, but so did the obstacles. The whispers, the doubts, the moments of frustration. It all built toward an inevitable breaking point, one that would test both their resolve and their faith in each other. The cold winter night was alive with the hum of the city, but in the alleyway behind the bookstore where Jack worked, silence reigned. Jack was leaving late, a worn satchel slung over his shoulder. He was feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The job wasn't perfect, and he was still adjusting to the idea of being seen. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was moving forward. Barron had been instrumental in that, and Jack couldn't deny the gratitude he felt, even if expressing it didn't come easy. As he walked toward the subway station, the sound of shuffling footsteps behind him made him pause. He glanced over his shoulder, but saw no one. Shrugging it off, he quickened his pace. The city was unpredictable, and Jack had learned to stay alert. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and when he turned again, two figures emerged from the shadows. "Hey, buddy," one of them called, his voice dripping with mock friendliness. He was a lanky man with a crooked grin, his partner shorter but stockier, his hands stuffed into the pockets of a ratty coat. "Got a minute?" Jack tensed. He had nothing worth stealing, but he knew that didn't matter. "I don't want any trouble," he said, his voice steady despite the fear creeping in. "Trouble?" The shorter man chuckled, stepping closer. "We're just looking for a little help. You look like a guy who knows what it's like to struggle. Spare some cash?" Jack shook his head. "I don't have anything. I'm just trying to get home." The lanky man's grin faded. "See, that's the problem. Everyone's just trying to get home. But no one wants to share the wealth. What's in the bag?" "Nothing you'd want," Jack replied, clutching the strap tighter. "Let's see for ourselves," the shorter man said, lunging forward. Jack staggered back, but the taller man was already behind him, grabbing his arms. Jack struggled, the satchel slipping from his grasp and landing on the ground. The shorter man picked it up, rummaging through it with a sneer. "Books?" he scoffed, tossing one to the ground. "What kind of loser?" "Hey!" A voice rang out from the end of the alley, firm and commanding. All three men froze, turning to see Barron standing there, his tall frame silhouetted against the streetlights. He had been on his way to meet Jack, planning to surprise him with some good news, a connection he'd made with a teaching program willing to give Jack a chance. But now, seeing the scene before him, his blood ran cold. "Let him go," Barron said, his voice steady but edged with tension. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on the men. The lanky man smirked. "And who's this? Another do-gooder?" Barron didn't answer. He pulled out his phone, holding it up. "I've already called the police. They'll be here any minute." The shorter man cursed under his breath, glancing at his partner. "We don't need this." "Yeah, let's go," the lanky man agreed, shoving Jack forward roughly. Jack stumbled but caught himself, glaring at the two men as they disappeared into the night. Barron rushed forward, his hand on Jack's shoulder. "Are you okay?" Jack nodded, though his hands were trembling. "Yeah, thanks to you." Barron frowned, picking up the scattered contents of Jack's bag. "This city can be brutal," he said quietly, "but you don't have to face it alone." As they walked to the subway together, Jack's mind raced. He had always prided himself on his independence, even when it meant enduring hardship. But tonight, he had seen the limits of what he could handle on his own. And Barron, despite his privileged background, had stepped in without hesitation. By the time they reached the station, Jack stopped, turning to face Barron. "Why do you care so much?" he asked, his voice tinged with a mix of confusion and gratitude. "You don't owe me anything. Most people wouldn't even look twice at me." Barron hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because I believe everyone deserves a chance," he said finally. "And because, if I were in your position, I'd hope someone would do the same for me." Jack studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You're a good kid. You know that?" Barron chuckled softly. "I'm just trying to do what feels right." But as they parted ways that night, Barron couldn't shake the lingering unease. He had seen the fear in Jack's eyes, the vulnerability that came with living on the edge. And he knew that one act of kindness wouldn't be enough to shield him from the harsh realities of the world. Something had to change, and Barron was more determined than ever to find a way to make that happen. The following days were a blur of heightened tension for both Barron and Jack, each carrying the weight of the incident in different ways. Jack couldn't shake the images of the two men who had accosted him, their sneers and threats still echoing in his mind. Despite Barron's calm reassurance, the fear had settled deeper into his bones, making it difficult for him to focus on anything else. Even when he tried to get back to his temporary job at the bookstore, he couldn't escape the feeling that someone, was always watching, waiting to take from him again. As for Barron, the aftermath of the confrontation affected him in ways he hadn't expected. The looming threat of the police had been a bluff, but his decision to call for help hadn't come without consequences. Within hours of the incident, photos of Barron standing in the alley with Jack circulated on social media. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as an act of unexpected heroism, but the reaction was far from universally positive. "Barron Trump saves homeless man," the headline read, but beneath it, the comments were a mix of admiration and criticism. Some hailed him as a compassionate figure, willing to step into the world of the less fortunate. Others, those who viewed Barron's background as a liability, accused him of seeking publicity or patronizing those he had no understanding of. It didn't matter that Barron had acted out of genuine concern. In the public eye, it was all too easy for narratives to be warped. The voices in Barron's own circle didn't help. His friends had mixed reactions. Some congratulated him for doing the right thing, while others questioned his judgment. One childhood friend, Cameron, had even gone so far as to mock Barron for getting too caught up in the poor man's drama, as he put it. "Just stay in your lane," Cameron had said, his tone dismissive. "You've got your own life to deal with. What's with all this? Helping people who won't even help themselves." Barron's jaw had tightened, but he didn't respond. The comment stung more than he let on, and as the days dragged on, the weight of the disapproval began to seep into his thoughts. He started questioning himself, wondering if he had misjudged the situation, if maybe he had stepped too far into something that wasn't his place. The first time he saw Jack after the incident, Barron could sense a change. Jack seemed quieter, more withdrawn than before. The bond that had formed between them, fragile as it was, now felt strained. They met at a local park, a quiet place where Barron knew they could talk without interruption. "How are you holding up?" Barron asked, his voice tentative. Jack didn't meet his eyes immediately. Instead, he stared out at the small group of children playing in the distance, their laughter a stark contrast to the heavy silence between them. "I don't know," Jack said finally, his voice tight. "I keep thinking, maybe you shouldn't have gotten involved. Maybe you just made things worse." Barron blinked in surprise. "What do you mean?" I thought it helped. I thought we were making progress." Jack shook his head, his gaze still fixed ahead. "No, Barron, you don't understand. People don't see me the way you do. I'm not some project to be fixed. I'm just a guy who's stuck. And now, because of you, I feel like I owe something to the world. Like I'm some charity case." Barron's chest tightened, a wave of guilt crashing over him. "That was never my intention," he said quickly, moving closer. "I didn't mean to make you feel like—" "I know," Jack interrupted, his voice quieter now. "I know. But when everyone knows you've been saved, they don't see you the same anymore. They don't see me." The weight of Jack's words landed heavily in Barron's chest. He had tried so hard to help, but in doing so, had he inadvertently trapped Jack in a new kind of isolation, one that came with pity and expectations? Barron didn't have an answer. All he knew was that he had tried to do something good, and now, it seemed like the very thing he thought would help had become a burden. Meanwhile, the media frenzy continued. The headlines shifted focus from Barron's good deed to the growing public debate surrounding the issue of homelessness. Some criticized Barron for using Jack's plight as a platform to elevate his own image. Others questioned the root causes of homelessness, but there was little attention given to Jack as a person, to his struggles and his resilience. He had become a symbol, a face in the story, but not a person anyone truly understood. Barron had known the media could twist narratives, but he hadn't anticipated how it would twist his own actions. The admiration he had hoped to receive felt hollow, and the criticism felt personal. The more he thought about it, the more he wondered if his efforts had been misguided. Maybe he had tried to fix something that wasn't his to fix, or perhaps his actions had inadvertently highlighted a divide between his world and Jack's that was impossible to bridge. For Jack, the social fallout was just as intense. The whispers, the stares, they hadn't stopped, but now they were louder. The bookstore where he had been working let him go, citing scheduling issues, though Jack suspected they were just looking for an excuse. The shift in how people treated him had been subtle at first, but over time, it became undeniable. He had been seen with Barron Trump, and to some, that was enough to render him different, tainted, even. One evening, Jack sat on a park bench, his hands clutching a cup of coffee, the same cup Barron had handed him days earlier. He thought about the places he had been and the things he had lost. The path to recovery, to normalcy, felt impossibly long now. More than anything, Jack wished things could go back to the way they had been before Barron had walked into his life, before he had been thrust into a spotlight he wasn't ready for. Barron, too, wrestled with a sense of defeat. He had reached out with the best of intentions, and yet the more he tried to help, the more it felt like he was making things worse. The divide between the world he lived in and Jack's world seemed insurmountable, and no matter how hard he tried, the consequences of his actions hung in the air like an unspoken question. Had he done the right thing? In the days that followed, Barron and Jack remained distant. They exchanged brief messages, but the connection they had once shared now seemed distant, a fleeting memory overshadowed by the weight of expectation and regret. The world had moved on, as it always did, but for both men, the echoes of their brief encounter lingered. Unresolved, haunting, and for the first time, leaving them both unsure of the path forward. As the weeks passed, Barron began to withdraw from the public eye. The media frenzy had subsided, but its impact lingered, much like the haunting questions that circled in his mind. He had become a symbol, whether he liked it or not, and the weight of that title was more than he could bear. His father's voice had been a constant presence in his life, urging him to rise above the noise, to focus on his responsibilities and ignore the distractions. Yet Barron found himself questioning those very principles. Was he doing what was expected of him, or was he simply going through the motions? Jack, on the other hand, had retreated into the shadows of his own life. The days had become harder to navigate, and the weight of his circumstances felt heavier than ever. He had lost the sense of hope he'd briefly felt, that fleeting moment of connection with Barron, which had now dissolved into something complicated and difficult to define. The people who had once shown him kindness now avoided his gaze, uncomfortable with his presence. The bookstore where he had worked had been a temporary lifeline, but after his dismissal, Jack had found himself without direction. It wasn't just about losing his job, it was about the loss of a future, the loss of belief in any sort of change. The kindness Barron had shown seemed like a distant memory now, overshadowed by the reality that Jack was still, at his core, invisible to the world. There were days when he considered leaving the city, starting over somewhere else. But he knew the truth, that the same struggles would follow him, no matter how far he ran. And so, he stayed. Months later, Barron returned to the park where they had last spoken. The air was colder now, the trees bare, the grass dull beneath his feet. He thought he saw Jack at the far end of the park, sitting alone on a bench. His heart quickened, and for a moment, he considered turning away, letting the silence remain between them. But something stopped him. He owed Jack more than that. He owed him an explanation, even if it was one he wasn't sure how to give. He walked toward the bench, the crunch of leaves beneath his shoes louder than the thoughts racing through his mind. When Jack saw him approaching, there was no surprise, no welcoming smile, just a quiet acknowledgement. He didn't stand, didn't even make an effort to look up. "Jack," Barron said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Can we talk?" Jack's gaze shifted toward the ground. "I don't know what there is to say," he replied, his voice flat. "Everything's the same. It doesn't change." Barron sat down beside him, the space between them heavy with unspoken words. He wasn't sure what to expect, but the bitterness in Jack's tone stung more than he anticipated. He had hoped, foolishly, that time might heal the distance that had grown between them, but the reality was far different. "I didn't mean for things to end up like this," Barron said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to help. I thought that maybe I could make things better for you." Jack looked up then, his eyes hard. "You can't fix everything, Barron. You can't fix me. And you can't fix the world. It doesn't work like that." Barron nodded slowly, taking in Jack's words. The truth of them settled over him like a cold wind. In trying to help, in trying to reach across the divide, he had only highlighted how far apart they truly were. The world he inhabited and the one Jack had known were too different, too vast to reconcile with a single act of kindness. "I know," Barron murmured. "I was trying to make a difference, but maybe I was just fooling myself." For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. Then, Jack spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Maybe it's not about fixing things," he said. "Maybe it's just about being there, even if we can't change anything. Maybe that's the best we can do." Barron's heart sank at the thought. He had wanted to fix Jack's life, wanted to offer him a way out of his struggles. But Jack was right. Life wasn't about grand gestures or saving someone else. It was about presence, about showing up for the people who needed it most, without expectations. "I think I understand now," Barron said quietly. "I didn't know how much I was asking of you. I thought I could change things, but I couldn't. Not in the way I thought I could." Jack glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, well, maybe that's the lesson. You can't change everything, Barron. Not with money, not with influence. Sometimes, just being there is enough." They sat in silence for a long time, the world around them moving on as it always did. Barron thought about his life, about the expectations placed on him, about the things he had tried and failed to control. He realized then that helping people wasn't about solving their problems. It was about showing up, even when the outcome was uncertain. For Barron, the road ahead wasn't clear. He would never have the answers he sought, and the world's opinion of him would always shift with the wind. But he had learned something invaluable through his interactions with Jack, that sometimes the most meaningful connections came from shared humanity, not from solving problems. It was in the quiet moments of understanding, the unsung acts of compassion, where real change began. As for Jack, he knew the path forward wouldn't be easy. He still had his demons to face, and the road to rebuilding his life was a long one. But for the first time in a while, he didn't feel quite as alone. Barron had shown him that even small gestures of kindness could leave lasting ripples, even if they didn't immediately change the world. Both men left the park that day with something new, a sense of clarity, perhaps, or a new understanding of themselves. Their lives, once forever altered by a single encounter, now seemed to stretch out before them, uncertain but full of potential. And with that, the story closed, a quiet reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of kindness are those that come without expectation, those that simply show up and remain, even when the world demands more. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more.